The gate swung open before Annie Langston had finished her second sentence. She had rehearsed the speech for 3 days on the back of a mule-drawn wagon, practicing the words under her breath, while red dust coated her lips, and the Nevada sun turned the world into a shimmering wall of punishment. She had planned for refusal. She had prepared for the door to stay shut, for the man behind it to look her over with cold dismissal, and send her back down the road with nothing but the same hollow dread she had carried from Abilene. She had braced for rejection the way a person braces for a blow they know is coming. Shoulders pulled tight, chin tucked, eyes already halfway toward the ground. She had not prepared for this. Paul Ford stood on the other side of the tall iron gate, one hand resting on the latch he had just thrown back, his dark eyes moving over her face with an expression she could not read. He was taller than she expected from the description in the letter. His jaw was unshaved, his shirt was dusty at the collar, and there was a long scar across the back of his right hand that caught the afternoon light. He looked like a man who had survived something nobody had ever bothered to ask him about, and he looked like a man who was in no particular hurry to explain himself. Annie's mouth was still open around the beginning of her third practice sentence. She had gotten as far as, "Mr. Ford, I understand if you don't want," when the gate had simply swung back on its hinges and he had stepped aside. "You look like you have been riding since before breakfast," he said. His voice was low and even, like a river that had stopped being in a hurry. "Come in." She stared at him. "I haven't told you who I am yet." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but close enough to the shape of one. "You got off a supply wagon with a canvas bag and a hat that belonged to somebody larger than you, and you walked up to my gate in July heat in Nevada looking like you were ready to be arrested and hanged. Only one kind of person comes up this road that way." He stepped back another foot, giving her space. "Come in, Miss Langston." The sound of her name in his mouth stopped her breath. She walked through the gate. That was how it started, not with the careful negotiation of two cautious strangers, not with the polite exchange of credentials and expectations, but with a gate thrown open before she was ready, and a name spoken as if he had been waiting for it all along. But to understand why that moment cracked something open inside Annie Langston's chest, like the first fault line in a wall she had spent years building, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, and to the particular kind of desperation that can make a woman board a wagon headed into Nevada with nothing but a canvas bag, 2 letters, and a secret she had told no one. Annie Langston was 24 years old in the spring of 1882, and she was already running out of options. She had grown up in Abilene under the roof of her uncle, Marcus Langston, who ran the dry goods store on the eastern end of town, and who treated her with the specific flavor of contempt reserved for dependents who were useful but unwanted. She was useful because she kept his books, managed his inventory, and handled the correspondence that he was too impatient and too proud to do properly himself. She was unwanted because she was the daughter of his dead brother, a man Marcus had considered a fool and a failure, and every time Marcus looked at Annie he saw that failure staring back at him. She had learned early to be quiet, to be precise, to make herself as small and efficient as possible, so that Marcus would have fewer reasons to remind her of her position. She learned to keep her opinions behind her teeth and her feelings behind her eyes. She learned that the safest place for any secret was deep inside yourself, folded so tight it might as well not exist. The first crack in the wall came in February of that year, when Marcus told her he had arranged for her to marry Gerald Hatch. Gerald Hatch was 51 years old, a widower with 3 adult sons who all worked his cattle operation north of town. He was not a cruel man exactly, but he was a man who had made up his mind about the world a long time ago and saw no reason to update his views. He had agreed to the arrangement with Marcus because he needed someone to manage his household accounts and maintain order in a house full of men, and Annie's reputation for being capable and undemanding made her an economical choice. No one had asked Annie what she thought about any of it. She sat in the back room of the dry goods store the night after Marcus told her, surrounded by inventory ledgers and candle smoke, and she made a decision that frightened her more than Gerald Hatch ever could. She was going to leave, not quietly, not apologetically. She was going to find something real. The advertisement had appeared in a weekly gazette that came through Abilene by mail coach. It was tucked between a notice about livestock prices and an announcement about a land survey dispute, and she almost missed it because Marcus had used the outer page to wrap a parcel. But she caught 3 words through the wrapping paper, and she pulled the gazette out with hands that were already moving faster than her common sense. The advertisement read as follows: Ford Ranch, Elko County, Nevada Territory. Seeking capable woman of steady character for bookkeeping, household management, and correspondence. Reasonable wages. Permanent position available for the right candidate. Inquiries to P. Ford, Elko Post Office, Nevada Territory. It was not a mail order bride advertisement. It was a job posting. Annie had stared at it for a long time. She had written back the same night, the kind of letter that takes 3 drafts before you decide that honesty is the only version worth sending. She told Paul Ford that she had managed a dry goods store's accounts for 6 years, that she could read and write in both English and a working amount of Spanish, that she knew inventory management and supplier correspondence, and that she was available to start as soon as possible. She did not tell him about Gerald Hatch. She did not tell him about Marcus. She told him she had her own reasons for wanting to relocate and that she would explain them in person if he wished to know. She mailed the letter before sunrise. His reply came 3 weeks later, and it was exactly 8 sentences long. He confirmed the position was available. He described the ranch and its operation briefly and without embellishment. He named a wage that was reasonable, as advertised. He mentioned that the nearest town was 12 miles from the ranch house. He said that if she was the kind of woman who needed the company of a lively social scene, she should look elsewhere. He said he ran a working ranch and expected everyone under his roof to understand that. He said he would arrange for her to travel from the nearest rail point to the ranch at his expense. The last sentence was this: "If you come, I will give you a fair chance." She read that last sentence 4 times. A fair chance. Not a guarantee. Not a promise of anything beyond what was reasonable. Just a fair chance. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 6 years, and it unmade her completely. She wrote back to accept. She did not tell Marcus until the morning of the day she left, and even then she told him only that she was going, not where, because she knew that Marcus would find some legal or social mechanism to stop her if she gave him enough information to work with. She left him a letter on the counter of the dry goods store, beside the spring inventory ledger which she had finished and balanced the night before, because whatever else she was leaving behind, she was not going to leave his books in disorder. She left Abilene on a Tuesday morning in April with the canvas bag. 2 letters, one from Paul Ford confirming her position, one from a woman in Elko named Clara Deeds, who served as a local reference for the ranch's legitimacy. Her savings, which amounted to $11.40, and the particular kind of terror that lives just under courage when you are doing something you cannot take back. The journey took 3 weeks by rail to the Utah border and another 4 days by supply wagon from there into Nevada, because the ranch was northeast of Elko, and the road was not much more than a suggestion pressed into the desert by years of wagon wheels and stubborn determination. It was during those 4 days on the wagon that the fear really dug in. Because 3 days into the journey, the wagon driver, a sun-worn man named Clement who was delivering feed sacks and barrel goods to several ranches along the route, mentioned Paul Ford's name in a way that made Annie's stomach drop. "Ford," Clement said, looking at her sideways from under the brim of his hat. "You working for Paul Ford?" "I have been hired for his ranch, yes," Annie said. Clement was quiet for what felt like a long time. The wheels ground over rock and the mule plodded on. "How much do you know about him?" "Enough," Annie said with more certainty than she felt. Clement scratched the side of his jaw. "He is a fair man," he said finally in the tone of a person who is choosing to say the fair thing and leaving the rest behind it unsaid. "Hard but fair. Ranch runs well. He keeps to himself more than most. Had some trouble a few years back." "What kind of trouble?" Clement shook his head slightly, which was its own kind of answer. "The kind men don't talk about easily." Annie let it rest. But the question burrowed into her for the rest of the journey, and by the time the wagon crested the last rise and she saw the Ford ranch laid out below her in the flat afternoon light, the long main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the dark green of the kitchen garden against the ochre land, she had convinced herself thoroughly that Paul Ford was going to take one look at her, remember the trouble, recall whatever dark past Clement had hinted at, and tell her the position had been filled. Hence the speech. Hence the 3 days of rehearsal. Hence the shock when the gate opened before she finished. The ranch yard was larger than it looked from the rise. There was a hand pump near the kitchen garden, a woodpile stacked with clear purpose along the south wall of the barn, and a rope strung between 2 posts near the bunkhouse with clean work clothes drying in the dry air. It smelled of hay and horses, and something cooking beans and something spiced, she thought. And after 3 weeks of travel, the smell of an occupied, functioning place was almost enough to make her knees uncertain. Paul Ford walked ahead of her toward the main house without looking back to see if she was following, which she found both rude and oddly reassuring, because it implied he simply expected her to follow rather than needing to escort her like she was fragile or suspect. "Water first," he said, pushing open the door. "Then I will show you where you'll sleep. Then we will talk about what the work actually looks like." The inside of the main house was plainer than she had imagined but cleaner than she had feared. The walls were whitewashed plaster, cracked in places but maintained. The floor was wooden board. There was a large stone fireplace in the main room, currently cold, and a table near the window with 3 chairs and a lamp. Along the far wall, a desk was covered in papers, ledgers, letters, land survey documents, in a state of organized desperation that told her immediately why he needed someone who could manage correspondence. He poured water from a ceramic pitcher into a tin cup and set it on the table in front of her without ceremony. She drank the whole thing in one long pull, and when she lowered the cup he was watching her with that same unreadable expression. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it for a moment. "Someone older." "Someone more," he searched for the word. "Resigned." "I am not resigned," Annie said. "No," he agreed, and something in his voice shifted, a very slight softening like the first given cold ground. "You are not." He showed her the room. She would have a small room off the back of the main house, past the kitchen, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the kitchen garden, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. It was modest. It was hers. The privacy of it after years of Marcus's house, where nothing had felt truly hers, nearly made her eyes sting. She unpacked her canvas bag while he stood in the doorway and told her, in that level and unhurried voice, the shape of the work. He ran cattle, about 400 head on the current count, with a crew of 6 men in the bunkhouse. He had a contract to supply beef to 3 mining operations in Elko County, which required documentation, invoicing, and ongoing correspondence with the mining company representatives. His accounts were 14 months behind on proper organization because his previous bookkeeper, a man named Wilson, had left suddenly to follow a silver strike into Utah, and had left the ledgers in a state that Paul described as criminal negligence, except I could not decide who to charge. He needed her to untangle the financial records, take over supplier and buyer correspondence, manage the household provisions, and maintain general order in the paper side of the operation. He also mentioned, with a certain careful distance, that the crew was fed from the ranch kitchen, and that if she was willing to oversee the kitchen stock and planning, not the cooking itself, which was handled by a hand named Diego who had come up from Sonora 12 years ago and considered his kitchen a sovereign territory, it would be helpful. "Anything you do not understand about the work, ask me," he said. I would rather answer questions than fix errors. And anything I think could be done better." Annie asked. He looked at her steadily. "Tell me that too," she nodded. He left her to settle in. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed for exactly 2 minutes, listening to the sounds of the ranch, a horse moving in the corral, the distant voice of one of the hands, the squeak of the water pump. And then she stood up, smoothed her dress, went to the desk in the main room and sat down to look at the ledgers. They were, as advertised, a disaster. Wilson had clearly been a man who understood numbers in isolation but had no concept of systematic recording. Entries were inconsistent, dates were missing, and in 3 places he had apparently used the same page for both expenses and personal notes about weather conditions and a man he seemed to dislike named Perkins. There were invoices folded inside ledger covers, correspondence stuffed between pages, and a stack of unopened letters from the mining company representative dated as far back as September of the previous year. Annie picked up the first unopened letter, read it, set it down, and began to make a list. Paul came back through the main room an hour later and stopped when he saw her at his desk, surrounded by organized stacks of paper and writing notes in the margin of a fresh page. He stood there for a moment without speaking. "You found the burial ground," he said finally. "I found the mining company letters," she said, not looking up. 3 of them are time-sensitive inquiries that have gone unanswered for months. We need to respond to those first. The invoicing discrepancy from November to March can be resolved once I understand your cattle pricing structure, which I will need you to explain to me tomorrow." And whoever Wilson was, he had a habit of recording loans to the hands in a column labeled miscellaneous supplies, which means your expense records are incorrect by at least. She tallied the column quickly, $63 and some cents going back to last summer. There was a silence. She looked up. Paul Ford was leaning one shoulder against the doorframe, and the expression on his face had changed from unreadable to something she could not quite name. Something that looked, she thought, cautiously like relief. $63.15, he said. "You knew." "I knew something was wrong. I did not know how to find it." She set down her pen. "It is findable. I will have a clear picture for you by the end of the week." He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded. "Supper is at sundown," he said. "Diego will let you know." He walked out, and Annie turned back to the ledgers, and that was the beginning. The first week was work, pure and precise. Annie moved through the financial records like someone clearing a trail, systematic, unhurried, paying attention to every tree before she moved it. She drafted responses to the 3 outstanding mining company letters, brought them to Paul for review, and felt something warm and private when he read them, made one small correction to a figure, and handed them back saying good. She reorganized the ledger system into a format she had developed during her years with Marcus's store, with separate columns for each category of expense and income, clear date entries, and a running balance that could be verified at a glance. Paul reviewed her reorganization at the end of the 3rd day, standing behind her at the desk and working through the new format with his index finger moving along the columns. He smelled like horses and dust and a faint trace of wood smoke, and she was very conscious of the proximity, but she kept her eyes on the page and her voice even. "This is cleaner than anything Wilson ever produced," he said. "Wilson recorded weather observations in your accounts payable," she said. "It would not be difficult to improve on that." He made a sound that might have been, in a man less contained, a laugh. She discovered that week that Paul Ford was a man of fewer words than most, but that the words he chose were precise and worth listening to. When he talked to his hands, he was direct and fair, and she observed that the 6 men in the bunkhouse, Devlin, Santos, Thorne, Reyes, Cutler, and Old Marsh, who had been with the ranch since before Paul arrived, treated him with a combination of respect and what she could only describe as genuine loyalty, the kind that comes not from fear, but from a history of being treated decently. She learned from Diego, who was expansive and talkative in the kitchen in ways that Paul was not, that Paul had bought the ranch 6 years ago from a man named Alderton, who had run it into the ground through bad management and worse choices. Paul had come from Arizona with money that no one in Elko County quite understood the origin of, and within 2 years, he had turned the operation from barely solvent to consistently profitable. Diego said this with the pride of someone who had watched it happen and considered himself part of the cause. Before him, this was a place you worked because you had nowhere else to go, Diego said, chopping onions with the efficiency of a man who has made peace with the process. Now it is a place you work because it is worth working. Annie filed that away. On the 5th day, she found the other letters. They were in the locked lower drawer of the desk, the one she had noticed but not touched because it was locked and not her business. But Paul left the key on the desk ring one morning absent-minded. She thought, not deliberate, and she sat with it for 10 minutes before she admitted that the drawer was probably relevant to the accounts, and that she could not do her job thoroughly if she was avoiding things out of misplaced discretion. She opened the drawer. There were no financial records inside. There were 3 letters, bound with a piece of string that had been tied and untied enough times to go limp, and a folded newspaper clipping dated 1878 from a Tucson newspaper. The clipping was about a fire. She read enough to understand that it was about a fire at a property near Tucson in which a woman had died, and the name in the article was someone named Catherine, no last name given in what she could see of the clipping, and she stopped reading because this felt like something that had not been meant for her. She locked the drawer and put the key back on the ring. But the fire lived in her mind after that, and the name Catherine, and the way Paul sometimes stood at the window in the evening after supper looking out at the land, with an expression that was not quite peace and not quite grief, but something old and settled somewhere between the two. She said nothing about it. She had her own things she had not told him. The first week became 2 weeks, and 2 weeks became a month, and the rhythm of the ranch settled around her in a way that was so different from Marcus's house that she sometimes had to remind herself it was real. Here she ate at a table with other people. Here her work was noticed and appreciated. Here she could walk out to the kitchen garden in the evening and stand in the cooling air and hear nothing but distance, and it was not threatening distance. It was generous distance, the kind the West offers when it is in a benevolent mood. Paul paid her at the end of the first month. He set the coins and bills on the desk beside her in a neat stack without ceremony, and she counted them without ceremony, and they were exactly the amount agreed. The mining company acknowledged all 3 letters, she told him. We have confirmed orders through September. I know. Hendricks sent a wire. He paused. He asked who was handling correspondence now. He said the language was considerably clearer than what he was used to. What did you tell him? That I had hired someone capable. He said it simply, without decoration, and she felt it more than if he had said something elaborate. It was around this time that the trouble came back to find Paul Ford, and Annie was the first to see it coming. She was in the main room working through supplier invoices when a rider came into the yard fast and dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. She watched through the window as Paul came out of the barn, and the rider, a man she did not recognize, lean and sunburned, with a hat pulled low, handed him a letter or document from a coat pocket. Paul read it standing in the yard. She watched his face, and she saw what was there. Something tightening, something controlled, the face of a man putting a door between himself and a feeling very quickly. He came inside still holding the document. He stopped when he saw her. I am sorry, she said, moving to rise. I will go to my room if you need the stay, he said. It was one word, and it was not an order, it was something closer to a request. He sat down heavily in the chair across from the desk and set the document on the table. She sat back down. She did not look at the document, but she was aware of it. It is about the Alderton family, he said after a moment. The man I bought this ranch from, he had a son, younger one, Daniel Alderton. There has been a dispute. About the ranch, Paul looked at the document. About the terms of the original sale. Daniel Alderton has filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office saying the original agreement was fraudulent, that the sale was made under duress, and that Alderton Sr. was not of sound mind when he signed. The implications of that landed cleanly in Annie's understanding. That would mean that the property transfer could be challenged. Yes, he set the document down. I have documentation of the sale, a proper contract signed before a notary in Elko. But these things take time and money and an attorney, and the claim will tie up the ranch's operating status if the land office decides to investigate seriously. She looked at him carefully. What do you need? He seemed almost surprised by the directness of the question. I need someone who can organize the documentation for a legal review. Letters, contracts, the original deed, all the financial records from the time of purchase, a clear picture. I can do that, she said. Annie. It was the first time he had used her given name without the prefix, and they both noticed it at exactly the same moment, a small electric thing in the air between them. He cleared his throat. This is outside what I hired you to do. You hired me for correspondence and records management, she said. This is correspondence and records management, just with higher stakes. Tell me what documents you have and where they are, and I will build you a record that no land office challenge can easily argue with. He looked at her for a long time. She held the look without looking away, because she had learned in the past month that Paul Ford was a man who trusted what he could see clearly, and she wanted him to see her clearly. The documents are in the chest in my room, he said. I will bring them to you. He brought them. There were more than she expected: the original contract, correspondence with the previous owner going back 2 years before the sale, financial records of the ranch's state at time of purchase showing the degree of its distress, letters from 2 witnesses to the signing, and the notary's own record, which Paul had apparently thought to secure a copy of at the time of the original transaction. You kept all of this, she said. I grew up being told that paper protects you better than a gun, he said. Whoever told you that was right? She worked on the documentation package for 3 days straight, organizing everything chronologically, writing a clear summary letter that any Territorial Land Office reviewer could follow, and identifying the 4 strongest pieces of evidence against the Alderton claim. She brought it to Paul on the 4th morning and set it on the table in front of him, every document in sequence, labeled with her summary letter on top. He read the summary letter twice, slowly. Then he looked up. This is thorough, he said. It is complete, she corrected him gently. Thorough implies it was difficult. It was not difficult. The evidence supports the sale clearly. Daniel Alderton's claim is going to fail. You sound certain. I am certain. Look at the notary record. Look at the witness letters. Alderton Sr. was not only of sound mind, he was in a hurry to sell because he needed the money to settle personal debts that are documented in his own correspondence here. The claim has no foundation. She paused. The more important question is why Daniel Alderton is filing now, 6 years after the sale. What does he want? Paul was quiet for a moment. Money, he said. He has always needed money. He sees the ranch running well and he wants a share of what he never helped build. Then this is extortion dressed as a legal claim, she said. And the land office, once they see this package, should be able to see that. She was right. The documentation was sent to the Territorial Land Office in Elko by the following week, and within 30 days, a reply came confirming that the investigation had been closed without action, the original sale being found fully in order. Daniel Alderton's claim was dismissed. Paul told her the news in the kitchen while she was reviewing the monthly inventory with Diego. He handed her the land office letter across the kitchen table without saying anything. She read it. She folded it and handed it back. Good, she said. Good, he agreed. Diego said nothing, but he added an extra measure of spice to whatever he was cooking and looked out the window as if he were thinking about something pleasant. The thing that had been growing between Annie and Paul Ford was not a sudden thing. It was the kind of thing that grows in dry country, slowly, with a lot of root before any of it shows above the surface. It lived in the specific way he always waited, until she had finished her sentence before he responded, even when he knew what she was going to say. It lived in the way she had started leaving a second cup on the desk in the mornings, because he always came in from his first round with the hands wanting coffee, and she had noticed on which days and started anticipating it. It lived in the conversations they had after supper, which had started as brief practical exchanges about the next day's work, and had lengthened, gradually, and without either of them making a deliberate decision about it, into something that lasted until the lamp burned low. He told her, one night in July, about Arizona. Not about the fire, not directly, but about the years before Nevada, the work he had done in cattle trade, the places he had lived that had not quite felt like places to stay. She listened without asking questions he did not offer answers to, and she felt him measuring her responses the way a careful man measures distance, and she was patient with it because she understood that kind of carefulness from the inside. She told him about Abilene, about Marcus and the dry goods store and the ledgers, and the years of making herself useful without being allowed to be herself. She did not tell him about Gerald Hatch that night, but she told him about the feeling of writing the letter to Nevada and mailing it before sunrise and the terror of it, and the way Paul's last sentence, "I will give you a fair chance," had meant more to her than he could have known when he wrote it. He was quiet for a long time after she said that. "I almost did not run the advertisement," he said finally. "Why?" He looked at the lamp. "Because I was not sure I wanted someone else here, in this house." In the middle of things, he paused. "It took 3 drafts." She stared at him. "You wrote 3 drafts of an 8-sentence advertisement." Something crossed his face that was definitely the shape of a smile now, not hiding behind anything. "The first draft was 4 sentences. Wilson had just left and I was angry. The second draft was 20 sentences and I decided that was too much information for a stranger. The third draft was 8 sentences and I thought it said what needed to be said." "It did," she said. He looked at her then, fully and directly, the way he had when she had first walked through the gate, but with less of the measuring in it and more of something else. Something that asked a question without putting it into words. She held the look for a count of 3 before she said, "I am going to go to bed." "All right," he said. "Good night, Paul." It was the first time she had used his given name, and neither of them pretended not to notice. The warmth of it followed her down the hall to her room, and she lay on the narrow bed in the dark listening to the Nevada quiet and understanding that something was changing and that she was not afraid of it. He was afraid of it, she thought. That was the thing she was beginning to understand. She came to understand more about the fear in early August, when Clara Deeds came to visit. Clara Deeds was the woman who had written Annie the reference letter back in April, the local woman who had vouched for the ranch's legitimacy. And she turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman of about 50 who had been ranching outside Elko since before Nevada was a state, and who said what she thought with the efficiency of someone who had no patience for the alternative. She came for the day ostensibly to discuss a business matter with Paul, but she spent most of the afternoon in the kitchen with Annie and Diego, drinking coffee and observing. When Paul was out with the hands in the afternoon, Clara looked at Annie over her coffee cup and said, "He is different with you." Annie kept her voice neutral. "Different how?" "Lighter," Clara said. "Like he put something down." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He has been carrying that fire a long time." Annie set down her own cup. "Tucson," she said very quietly. Clara nodded. "You know about Catherine." "Only the name. I stopped reading." "Good instinct." Clara was quiet for a moment. "They were going to be married. She died in the fire the ranch caught when a lamp overturned the summer before he left Arizona. He was not there when it happened. He had been in town for a supply run." She paused. "He has always believed that if he had been there it would have been different. Whether that is true or not is God's question, not mine, but he has been carrying it." Annie absorbed this. The letters in the locked drawer, the evenings at the window, the specific quality of the silence that lived in Paul Ford's face sometimes, the silence of someone who has made a home in his own regret. "Why are you telling me this?" Annie asked. "Because you are here," Clara said simply, and he opened the gate. Annie looked at her. Clara's expression was knowing and direct and not unkind. I have known Paul Ford for 5 years. I have watched him run this ranch like it is the only thing in the world because, for a long time it was. I have watched women in Elko try to get his attention, and I have watched him not notice. She set down her cup. He noticed you before you finished your second sentence. After Clara left that evening, Annie sat in her room with the window open and the desert cooling around the house and thought about Catherine, who had died in a fire in Arizona in 1878, and about the quality of grief that lasts long enough to become part of a person's structure. She thought about the locked drawer and the letters bound with the limp string. She thought about the man who had opened the gate before she finished explaining herself, and she understood for the first time what that had meant, not just the practical generosity of it, but the exact thing it had cost him. She did not bring it up with him. It was his to bring up when he was ready, and she was not going to reach into his chest and handle it for him. But she paid attention in a different way after that, and the evenings she spent at the desk together after supper became something she understood had a different weight to them than either of them had officially acknowledged. The summer moved. The cattle contract was renewed at better terms, which Annie had worked toward through 3 months of careful correspondence with the mining company representative in Elko, and when Paul received the signed renewal he found her at the kitchen garden and told her plainly that she had done better work than he could have done himself. "Hendricks likes you," he said. "Hendricks likes that his invoices are correct," she said, pulling a weed from between the bean rows. "That is the same thing with Hendricks," Paul said. He crouched down on the other side of the row and started pulling weeds too, which was entirely unnecessary and clearly not why he had come out, and she found this endearing in a way she was careful not to let show. "I had a letter from Abilene," she said after a moment. He stopped. "From your uncle. How did you know about Marcus?" Clara mentioned him. He paused. "She wrote to the Abilene post office before she gave you the reference. She wanted to know if you were who you said you were." "She investigated me," Annie said without heat. There was something reassuring about it, actually. "What did she find out?" "That you managed the store accounts reliably for 6 years, and that your uncle was trying to find you, and that a man named Hatch had been asking questions about where you had gone." Annie was still for a moment. Then she said, "Gerald Hatch. Who is he?" She sat back on her heels in the garden row and looked at Paul, who had stopped pretending to pull weeds and was watching her with the steady, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered. She told him about Gerald Hatch. She told him about the arranged marriage and Marcus's plan, and the specific transaction of it. The household management exchanged for a legal and social status she had never asked for. She told him everything she had not told him in the letter and had not found the right moment to tell him since. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen garden was full of late afternoon light and the smell of warm earth, and Paul Ford looked at her with an expression that was not pity and was not shock, but was something closer to a slow, quiet anger on her behalf. "What does the letter say?" he asked. "I have not opened it." He nodded slowly. "Do you want to?" She thought about it honestly. "I want to know if there is a legal claim being made. Beyond that, no. Then open it for that reason. Nothing else in it is worth your time." She went inside and opened the letter. It was from Marcus, short and cold, demanding to know where she was and informing her that Gerald Hatch was still willing to honor the arrangement, and that she was making a fool of herself with this wandering. There was no legal claim, no authority behind it, just the leverage of a man who had always assumed that his disapproval was sufficient to compel behavior. She folded the letter, put it in the kitchen stove, and watched it burn. When she came back out to the garden, Paul was still there. He had actually finished pulling the weeds in the row she had been working, and he was leaning against the garden fence looking at the sky turning color toward evening. "There was no legal claim," she said. "I did not think there would be." He looked at her. "You are free of it." "I was free of it when I walked out of Abilene," she said. "I just needed to be sure." He nodded. The evening light was doing something particular to the angles of his face, and she looked at him for a moment longer than was entirely professional, and then she looked at the garden instead. "Annie." She looked back. He was looking at the fence post, not at her. His jaw was set with the expression she had come to recognize as the face he wore when he was doing something that cost him. "I'm going to say something, and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond." Her heart did something irregular. "All right." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "You came here for work, and that is what I offered you, and you have done that work better than I had any right to expect. I am not asking you to trade one arrangement for another. That is not what this is." He stopped. "What this is me telling you that for the first time in a long time, this house feels like a house instead of a place I am managing, and that is because of you. And I do not know what to do with that except to tell you honestly, because I do not know how to be honest about anything else and then be dishonest about this." The garden was very quiet. A horse shifted somewhere in the corral. Annie said, "I burned Gerald Hatch's prospect in a kitchen stove in Kansas and came to Nevada because of your last sentence." He looked at her finally, directly. "I will give you a fair chance," she said quietly. "That is what you wrote. 8 sentences, 3 drafts, and that one." She paused. "I have never asked for anything more than that. A fair chance to be seen for who I am, not for what I was useful for. You gave me that the moment you opened the gate." He moved off the fence post and crossed the 2 steps between them, and she stood still and let him come. And when he reached up and touched her face, just the side of her jaw, with the hand that had the scar across the back of it, she closed her eyes for one breath and then opened them and looked at him. "I am not the man you may have expected," he said. "I have not been expecting any particular man," she said. "I have been noticing the one in front of me." He kissed her in the kitchen garden in the last of the August light, and it was not a wild or desperate thing. It was careful and certain, the way he did everything, and she kissed him back with the particular relief of someone who has been traveling a long time and has finally found the right door. Diego, watching from the kitchen window, turned away and said nothing and added extra spice to supper again. What came after that was not without complication, because good things rarely are. Paul did not transform overnight from a private and self-contained man into an open and easy one. He was still the man who stood at the window in the evening sometimes, and there were days when the weight of what he carried from Arizona settled on him like weather, and Annie had to learn the difference between the silence that wanted company and the silence that wanted space. She made mistakes in that learning, reached for him once when he needed to be left alone, gave him space once when he was actually hoping she would stay, and both times he was honest with her about the mismatch, which she found both difficult and invaluable. She told him, one evening in September, "You do not have to tell me about Catherine. I want you to know that I know, and that it does not change what I see when I look at you, and that you are not obligated to open that drawer." He was still for a long time after she said that. Then he got up, went to his room, and came back with the letters and the newspaper clipping, and he sat down across from her at the desk and he told her. He told her about Catherine, who she was, the kind of woman she had been, the brightness of her, the plans they had made. He told her about the supply run to town, and the afternoon of clear sky and the smoke he saw from the road on the way back, and the running, and the understanding that arrived in him before he even reached the gate that there was nothing left to run toward. He told her about the years after, the drift west, the work with no purpose behind it except forward motion, the advertisement he had run in a Tucson Gazette 4 years ago and withdrawn before it ran because he could not face it, the Nevada ranch, and the way he had decided that building something was the only honest response to having lost something. He told her about the 3 drafts of the advertisement, and she already knew that, but hearing the context of it made it something different. When he was finished, she put her hand over his on the table, the scarred hand, and she said, "She sounds like she was worth loving." He looked at her with wet eyes that he did not try to hide. She was. Then loving her was not a failure. It is just a thing that happened and cost you, and you are allowed to have both. She paused. You are allowed to be here too. In this house with me, those are not opposites. He turned his hand over under hers and held on. They sat there at the desk in the lamplight for a long time without saying anything else, and it was the best kind of silence, the kind that is full rather than empty. By October, the ranch had settled into the rhythm of the coming winter, and the thing between Annie and Paul had settled into its own rhythm too, honest and careful, and deepening in the way of things that are built on good ground. He asked her to marry him in November, which in Nevada territory in 1882 meant riding into Elko with a purpose and speaking to a judge and doing the thing formally, because Paul Ford did things formally when they mattered. He asked her the night before, standing in the main room after supper with the fire going and the wind pushing at the windows, and he was direct about it as he was about everything. "I am asking you as a woman who came here for work and found something else," he said. "Not because you need this for security. You are capable enough that you never need anyone for security. I am asking because I want you here, not as an employee, not as a convenience, as my wife, as the person who sits at this table. As the person I tell things to." He paused. "If you say no, I will respect that and we will manage the rest sensibly because that is who we both are. But I am hoping you say yes." Annie Langston stood in the lamplight of a Nevada ranch house in November 1882 and thought about the version of herself who had mailed a letter before sunrise in Abilene 7 months ago, terrified and determined and rehearsing speeches for rejection. She thought about the gate swinging open before she finished. She thought about a fair chance. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He laughed. He actually laughed, the full real version of it that she had only heard in pieces before, and it was one of the better sounds she had encountered in her life. They rode into Elko the following morning, which was a cold and brilliantly clear Nevada morning with frost on the sage, and the sky the particular high blue it gets in late autumn when the summer haze is gone. Clara Deeds met them there because Paul had sent her a wire the previous week, presumptuous, Annie noted, and she found this endearing, and so did Diego, who had apparently taken the buckboard in before sunrise and was waiting outside the courthouse with an expression of deep personal satisfaction. The judge was a man named Prescott, efficient and decent, and the ceremony was brief. Paul's hand was steady when he held hers. Hers was too. When it was done and the paper was signed, Clara hugged Annie with the brisk warmth of a woman who approves of her own judgment in people, and Diego shook Paul's hand and then, in a departure from form, embraced him, and Paul put his arm around the old cook's shoulders for a moment before they stepped apart. They had supper in Elko at the hotel dining room, Annie and Paul, Clara, Diego, and by a cheerful coincidence old Marsh, who had come in on unrelated business and found them there and joined without being asked, in the way of a man who has been on a ranch long enough to feel himself part of its fabric. It was loud and warm and the food was plentiful, and Paul sat next to Annie and talked to her and looked at her the way she had learned to recognize, the look that was not guarded anymore. The drive home in the evening dark was cold and quiet, and she sat close to him on the buckboard seat, and he did not mind and neither did she. And the stars over Nevada were the kind of stars that exist in a place with no city close enough to dim them. The winter settled in, and the ranch kept its rhythm. Annie's work expanded naturally to include not just the accounting and correspondence but a broader partnership in the ranch's management decisions. She had opinions about the spring cattle contract renewal, and they were good opinions, and Paul took them seriously. They disagreed about the pricing structure twice and argued about it at the desk in the way of two people who respect each other enough to push back, and both times the resolution was better than either of their starting positions. She wrote to Clara Deeds regularly through the winter, and Clara wrote back with the same frank warmth she had shown in person. She did not write to Abilene. There was nothing in Abilene that required her correspondence. In January, a letter arrived for Paul from a man in Arizona, a lawyer representing the Tucson property where Catherine had died. The property had been in legal limbo since the fire, and it appeared there was a matter of a small insurance instrument that had been processed in Paul's name at Catherine's family's request, back in 1878, that had never been paid out due to a records dispute, and the lawyer was finally resolving it. It was a small amount of money. The money itself was not the point. Paul sat with the letter for a long evening. Annie was at the desk, working through the year-end account summary, giving him space but present. When he finally spoke, he said, "I want to use it to plant the south field in the spring. She liked green things, it seems right." Annie set down her pen. "That is a good use." He folded the letter. "She would have liked you," he said. "She liked people who said what they meant." Annie considered that. "That is a generous thing to tell me." "It is a true thing," he said. She went back to the accounts and he went to the window for a while. And then he came back to the table and sat down across from her and picked up his own list of spring supply orders, and they worked together in the lamplight. And it was ordinary, and it was, Annie thought, exactly what home was supposed to feel like. The spring of 1883 brought new cattle, a renegotiated contract, and the planting of the south field in alfalfa and kitchen garden expansion. And it brought something else in June that Annie confirmed with the help of Clara Deeds and a doctor who came out from Elko on a quarterly round. She told Paul on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen, because she had discovered there was no proper moment for this kind of news. You simply had to pick a moment and speak. He went very still. "You are certain?" he asked. "Clara and the doctor are both certain. February, they think." He was still for another long moment. She watched the stillness and waited. Then he moved, stood up from the table, came around to her side, and put his arms around her with the specific kind of care that is also its own kind of fierceness. "All right," he said quietly against her hair. "All right," she agreed. The summer was full and hot, and the ranch was at its most demanding, and Annie managed the correspondence and accounts from the desk with her steady diligence. And Paul found small ways to reduce her load without making a performance of it. And Diego declared a personal interest in her nutritional well-being that expressed itself in consistently excellent food and a series of opinions about what she should and should not be lifting. Old Marsh, who had been on that ranch longer than anyone and had seen the previous owner run it nearly to ruin and had watched Paul Ford build it back, came to Annie in the yard one August morning and handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a carved wooden bird, a road runner made from a piece of red cedar. "Made it last winter," he said gruffly. "Figured you ought to have something with roots in this place." She held it carefully. "Thank you, Marsh." "Ranch needed a woman," he said, with the dignity of a man who considers this a complete and sufficient explanation, and walked back to the barn. The autumn of 1883 came in cool and clean, and Annie Langston Ford, she had decided to keep Langston alongside Ford, because it was hers and she had brought it from Abilene, and it deserved to be kept, worked through the September accounts, and the contract renewals, and the kitchen garden harvest with the measured energy of someone who is tired but not depleted, who is full rather than heavy. Paul was more present that autumn than she had ever seen him, not hovering, not anxious in a way that expressed itself as management, but simply close, available. He rode back from the range earlier than necessary sometimes, and she did not comment on it, and he did not explain it, and they both understood perfectly well. The night the snow came for the first time, he sat on the edge of the bed after she had woken with that deep restlessness that had been visiting more frequently, and he talked to her about the ranch, about the spring, about the alfalfa field and how the south field had come up beautifully and held good water, about a letter he wanted to write to a cattle buyer in Reno that he thought might lead to a better rate on the spring drives. He talked until she was settled, and then they lay in the dark listening to the snow move against the window, which in Nevada is not a heavy sound but a whisper, a suggestion of quiet. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "You?" "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "It means we understand what it is." Their son was born in February of 1884, which was a cold and clear month in Nevada, the kind of cold that is clean rather than brutal. He was born in the morning, assisted by Clara Deeds, who had ridden out 2 days before and established herself in the household with the assurance of someone who has been needed and knows it. The labor was long but not dangerous, and when it was over and Annie was holding the baby and Paul was beside her with his hand over both of theirs, the room was very quiet. "Robert," Annie said. She had not discussed the name with Paul yet, they had gone around it but not settled, but she said it now and he repeated it quietly, testing the sound of it. "Robert Ford," he said. "Robert Langston Ford," she said. He looked at her. "He should have both," she said. "Like me." He nodded. "Robert Langston Ford," he said again. Clara, cleaning up with the efficiency of a woman who takes practical satisfaction in practical work, said without turning around, "Good name." Diego fed everyone extravagantly for a week after the birth and expressed his opinions on infant nutrition so freely that Paul eventually told him, with affection, to limit himself to one opinion per day. Diego reduced his frequency without reducing his enthusiasm. Marsh looked at Robert in Annie's arms a week after the birth, said "healthy boy," and went back to work, which was as effusive as Marsh got and which everyone understood as high praise. The spring of 1884 brought the Southfield second season, and the first ride-along Annie did after Robert's birth. On a mild April morning, when Paul took the outer range for a check, and she rode beside him on the steady bay mare that had always been her particular horse, with Robert bundled against her chest in the manner of practical frontier mothers for whom the work did not stop for anything. Paul rode close but not crowding, and they moved across the rangeland in the wide Nevada light, and she felt, with a completeness she could not have articulated before that moment, that this was the place her life had been heading. Not because of the destination, but because of the direction. "I want to write a letter to the Elko Gazette," she told him on the ride back. "About what?" "There is an advertisement in last month's issue for a bookkeeper in Carson City, poorly written. The wages are too low and the description of the work is insufficient. Someone is going to take that position not understanding what they are getting into." She paused. "I want to write to the Gazette about the standard of these advertisements. Women taking positions in Nevada need accurate information." He looked at her with the expression that she had learned was his version of pleased, the slight ease at the corners of his eyes. "Write it," he said. "You do not think it will cause difficulty?" "I think you are the most capable person in Elko County with correspondence," he said. "I think the Gazette will be better for receiving it. And I think that if anyone gives you difficulty about it, they will have to have the conversation with me." She wrote the letter. It was published 3 weeks later. She received 4 replies from the Gazette's readers, 2 agreeable and 2 argumentative, and she answered all 4 with the same measured precision she brought to everything. And one of the argumentative letters turned into a lengthy exchange with a woman in Elko named Mrs. Horton, who turned out to be a like-minded person running a millinery shop, who became, over the following year, something close to a friend. The summer of 1884 was prosperous. The spring cattle drive had gone well, the alfalfa was yielding, the mining contracts were renewed at the improved rate Annie had negotiated, and the ranch ran with the efficiency of a well-balanced ledger, everything in its column, every entry clear, the running balance consistently positive. Robert grew the way babies grow in healthy places, quickly and with apparent satisfaction at the enterprise. He had Paul's dark eyes and Annie's expression of focused attention, which Marsh described as "looks like he is already keeping a record of things," which Annie chose to take as a compliment. In the autumn of that year, a young woman arrived at the gate of the Ford Ranch, not unlike the way Annie had arrived 2 years before, dusty from the road and carrying the particular posture of someone braced for rejection. She was looking for temporary work, she said. Her name was Elena Reyes, and she was the younger sister of Santos, one of Paul's hands, and she could cook and clean, and she needed a position until spring. Annie was the one who went to the gate when Devlin called out that someone was at the gate asking. She opened it before the young woman finished her explanation. Elena stared at her. Annie smiled. "You look like you have been riding since before breakfast," she said. "Come in." Alina came in. She was 17, which was too young for permanent ranch work in the capacity Annie had. But she was energetic and capable, and she stayed through the spring as planned. And in that time she helped with Robert, helped with the kitchen, learned enough about household accounts from Annie that she left in April with skills she had not had when she arrived. When she left, she hugged Annie and said, "You are not what I expected from a rancher's wife." "What did you expect?" Alina thought about it. "Someone quieter." Annie laughed. Paul, loading Alina's bag onto the back of Santos's horse for the ride back to Elko, looked over at Annie laughing in the yard and held the look for a moment with the expression that was entirely his own and entirely for her. The spring of 1885 brought the cattle sale that confirmed what Annie had been projecting in the accounts for 2 years. The Ford Ranch had reached a scale and stability that warranted expansion. Not reckless expansion, not the overreach that had ruined Alderton, but considered growth. Another 200 head, a second contracted buyer, and the building of a proper office room added to the south side of the main house, so that Annie had her own space for the work rather than sharing the main room desk. Paul built the office room himself, with help from Thorne and Cutler, across the month of April. It had 2 windows. Annie had requested 2 windows, because she did not care to work in dim light, and a proper desk, and shelves for the ledgers, and a door that closed, which she had not asked for but appreciated immediately. She stood in the finished room on the May morning it was complete, looking at the shelves and the desk and the 2 bright windows, and Paul stood in the doorway watching her. "Is it right?" he asked. She turned to face him. Robert was on her hip, pointing at one of the windows with solemn 2-year-old interest. "It is more than right," she said. "It is exactly right." He came into the room and stood beside her, and they both looked at the shelves where the ledgers would go, the clean desk surface, the Nevada spring light coming through both windows at once, and it was a small thing in the scope of all the things that had happened. The gate opened, the fire survived, the letters written and answered, the claim defeated, the vows made in Elko with Clara Deeds and old Diego standing witness. But it was also not a small thing at all. It was evidence. It was the material record of a life built with intention on good ground. Robert patted Paul's arm to get his attention, and then pointed at the window again with renewed insistence. "Horse," he said, which was one of his 7 current reliable words and meant, in the full context of his communication, any number of things, but this morning almost certainly meant the corral. "There is definitely a horse," Paul confirmed, looking out the window. "Show him," Annie said. Paul took Robert from her and went to the window and pointed at the corral where 2 horses were moving in the morning light. And Robert leaned his small weight against Paul's chest and watched with the particular focused attention that was entirely his mother's, and that Paul had already decided was going to be formidable someday. Annie stood in her office, the words sat cleanly and warmly, and looked at the 2 of them at the window, the scarred hand and the small hand, the morning light through the Nevada glass, and she thought about Abilene and the supply wagon and the canvas bag and the speech she had rehearsed for 3 days and never finished. She thought about the gate opening. She had come expecting to be turned away, she thought. She had come rehearsed for rejection, armored for disappointment, prepared with explanations and apologies and deflections. She had walked up to that gate with her chin down and her shoulders tight, and her whole body already half apologizing for existing in the wrong place. And the gate had opened. Not because she had earned it yet, not because she had proven herself yet, but because Paul Ford was a man who had built something in the Nevada desert out of the ruins of his own grief, and who understood, on some level that had nothing to do with conscious thought and everything to do with years of quiet learning, what it looked like when someone came to a gate in good faith. He had given her a fair chance. She had given him one back, she thought. That was how it worked when it worked. She opened the first of the new ledgers, picked up her pen, and wrote the date at the top of the page. May 1885, Ford Ranch, Elko County, Nevada. She entered the first line of the new account under the heading she had already decided on, which was simply current. In the weeks that followed, the ranch settled into the pleasant and demanding rhythms of late spring. The new cattle were integrated into the herd without significant difficulty, which Devlin credited to the quality of the stock and Marsh credited to the quality of the management. And both of them were right in the particular and partial ways that loyal men are right when they are crediting their preferences. Paul rode the extended range with a daily thoroughness that Annie tracked through his absence and return, the particular satisfaction of knowing a person's patterns well enough to measure the day by them. She had started something else that spring, quietly, without making an announcement of it. She had begun writing down the practices she had developed for ranch accounting and correspondence, the system, the methodology, the specific approaches that had worked at the Ford Ranch over 3 years of application. Not a book exactly, but something organized, something that could be explained to another person, Mrs. Horton, the Elko milliner who had become a correspondence friend after the Gazette letter, had mentioned twice that she knew women in the territory who were taking on bookkeeping work without any framework for it, learning through expensive error. Annie had offered to write up what she knew into something usable, and Mrs. Horton had said that would be valuable, and Annie had begun. She worked on it in the evenings, after Robert was asleep and the day's accounts were in order, at the desk in her office by lamplight. Paul often came in with his own evening work, and they sat in companionable parallel, each at their own tasks, occasionally sharing a piece of work with the other for review. He read her draft pages without asking what they were, waited until she offered them, and when she did one evening in June, handing him the first 12 pages with less nonchalance than she intended, he read them with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered. "This is clear," he said, "clearer than most of what comes out of the Elko business community. Do you think it is useful?" He looked at her over the pages. "Did you write it to be useful?" "Yes." "Then it is useful. The question is whether someone will publish it." She had not thought that far yet. She looked at the pages he handed back to her. "I was thinking of Mrs. Horton's connections. She knows the printer in Elko. The printer also does small pamphlets," Paul said. "I had him do the supply contract summaries last winter. I remember, the binding was adequate." "The binding was barely adequate," he agreed, "but the content was clear because you wrote the summaries." She looked at him. "Are you suggesting I approach the printer directly?" "I am suggesting that you wrote something valuable and that the next question is what you do with it." He set down his own papers. "What do you want to do with it?" She thought about it honestly. What she wanted was for it to help someone who was sitting in the back room of a dry goods store in Abilene, keeping books by feel and instinct without any structure, making themselves useful without being seen. Someone who did not know there was a system. Someone who did not know they could learn it. "I wanted to reach people who need it," she said. "Then let's go to Elko on Saturday and talk to the printer," he said simply. They went to Elko on Saturday. The printer was a man named Bauer, thorough and somewhat skeptical, who read the first 3 pages of Annie's draft while they stood in his shop and then looked up at her and said, "Who taught you this system?" "I developed it," she said. He looked at Paul. Paul said nothing, which was its own endorsement, and Bauer looked back at Annie and said he could produce 200 copies in pamphlet form if she could complete the text within 6 weeks. She completed it in 4. The pamphlet was titled Practical Accounts for the Western Ranch and Business by A.L. Ford, and it ran to 38 pages, and Bauer sold the first 50 copies out of his own print shop within 2 weeks, and Mrs. Horton sold another 30 through her millinery to the women of her acquaintance, and the remaining 120 went to the Elko County Trading Post, and a dry goods store in Battle Mountain, and a general store in Winnemucca, whose owner had read about it by word of mouth. Annie received a letter from a woman in Battle Mountain 3 months later, saying that the pamphlet had allowed her to reorganize her husband's mining supply accounts and identify an overpayment that had been running for 2 years. The woman said she felt, for the first time, like the work she did with figures had a foundation under it. Annie read the letter twice and then handed it to Paul, who read it and set it on the desk and looked at her. "I told you," he said. "You told me nothing," she said. "You asked what I wanted to do with it." "That is the same as telling you," he said, and she laughed, and he watched her laugh with the expression she had catalogued as his version of happiness, the one that was contained but full, the one that had taken her months to learn to read but which she now knew as well as her own reflection. The summer of 1885 was their third summer together, their second as husband and wife, and it was the summer Robert began to walk with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested he had already formed strong opinions about the trajectory of his own existence and was simply waiting for his legs to catch up. He had Paul's directness and Annie's focus and Diego's complete lack of patience for being ignored at mealtimes. He also had, by early August, an enthusiastic but entirely one-sided friendship with the road-runner bird that Marsh had carved, which he carried everywhere and introduced to every surface in the house with the seriousness of a naturalist cataloging a new continent. Marsh, on one of his increasingly frequent visits to the main house porch after supper, watched Robert show the carved bird to the dog with patient scientific gravity and said, "Going to be a good man." Paul, sitting beside Annie on the porch in the cooling evening, said quietly, "He is going to be exactly what his mother made of him." Annie said nothing, but she took Paul's hand in the dark and held it. In September, she told him she was expecting again. He took the news with the same quality of stillness as the first time, and then with the same particular careful fierceness. And the winter came in, and the accounts were in order, and the contracts were renewed, and the ranch was the place it had become, because two people with good instincts and honest natures had found each other through an advertisement in a gazette, and a letter mailed before sunrise, and a gate thrown open before a speech was finished. The second baby arrived in April of 1886, in the same Nevada spring that had become Annie's favorite season, the one where the sage turns silver green and the sky goes absolutely clear, and the world seems to be making an announcement about its own intentions. A girl this time. They named her Clara, for the woman who had told Annie that Paul had opened the gate. Paul held Clara in the crook of his arm the morning after the birth, sitting on the edge of the bed, while Robert stood beside the bed on his tiptoe looking at his sister with the solemn expression of a person encountering a development they had not been fully briefed on. "She is small," Robert said. "You were smaller," Annie told him. He considered this skeptically. "You were," Paul confirmed. Robert reached out and touched Clara's hand with one careful finger, and Clara's fingers closed around his in the way of newborns who have not yet learned to be cautious, and Robert looked up at his parents with an expression that was the precise combination of both of them. "All right," he said, which was, Annie thought, a word that ran in the family. Clara Deeds came to see her namesake a week after the birth, and stood in the main room holding the baby with an expression of restrained delight that she would have denied if pressed. "Good name," she said, in exactly the tone she had used to endorse Robert Langston Ford's name 2 years before. "We thought so," Annie said. Clara Deeds looked at Annie over the baby's head. "When you got off that supply wagon," she said, "you looked like a woman walking to her own trial. I felt like one. And now," Annie looked through the open door to where Paul was in the yard with Robert on his shoulders, pointing at something on the barn roof that Robert was apparently finding deeply interesting. The morning light was flat and gold, and the kitchen garden was coming up in its spring green, and the south field was already showing the season's first alfalfa growth, and the gate was standing open because the day was warm and no one had any reason to close it. "Now I feel like myself," Annie said, "which I think is the only destination that matters." Clara Deeds handed the baby back, nodded once with the efficient approval of a woman who considers this the correct answer, and went to the kitchen to find Diego, who she had been arguing pleasantly with for 2 years about the correct way to make chili, and who would no doubt have new ground to defend. Annie held Clara and walked to the doorway and stood in the light. Paul saw her from the yard and lifted his chin in the brief acknowledgement that in their particular language meant, "Are you all right?" She lifted hers back, which meant, "Yes, more than." He went back to showing Robert the bird's nest on the barn roof, and Robert pointed at it with the carved wooden road runner, apparently by way of introduction, and Diego's voice rose from the kitchen in cheerful argument, and Clara Deeds laughed, which was a sound nobody heard often and everyone valued, and the Nevada Spring went on being what it was. The ranch ran well. The accounts balanced. The letters went out and came back. The alfalfa grew in the south field that had been planted for Catherine, green against the red-gold land, and Paul rode past it every morning, and Annie did not ask what he thought about when he did, because she knew, and because knowing was enough, and because a person could carry the ones they had lost alongside the ones they had found if they had enough ground to walk on. They had enough ground. 3 years after Annie Langston had stood at the gate of the Ford Ranch and opened her mouth to begin the speech she had rehearsed on the back of a supply wagon, the gate of that ranch stood open in the morning light of a Nevada April, the way it stood most mornings now, because a woman who had come prepared to explain herself had arrived at a place that did not require the explanation. She had come expecting to be turned away. He had opened the gate before she finished explaining herself. And everything that had been built from that moment, the work and the trust and the arguments at the desk, and the evenings at the window, and the wedding in Elko with Clara Deeds and Diego standing witness, and the boy with his father's eyes, and the girl named for a woman who had said the right thing at the right moment, and the pamphlet in 38 pages and the letters answered, and the claims defeated, and the fire finally set down. All of it was what happened when a gate opened in good faith and two people walked through it together. The morning went on. The ranch went on. The gate stood open in the Nevada light, and the world kept its accounts in the way that worlds do, in growth and in season, and in the particular, irreplaceable record of days that were full. Robert Langston Ford grew into a boy who kept careful records of his own, and had his mother's way with a letter and his father's way with silence and old Marsh's way with the land. Clara Langston Ford grew into a girl who laughed easily and argued cheerfully, and who Clara Deeds, visiting on a spring afternoon 6 years later, said with complete satisfaction looked like she was going to be the kind of woman who makes things happen. Paul Ford stood at the gate one evening in the summer of 1887 and watched his wife ride in from the east pasture on the steady bay mare, dust in her hair and the account book under her arm, because she had ridden out to check the water allocation for the new well and brought the records with her, because Annie Langston Ford did not go anywhere without being useful, and he thought about the letter that had taken 3 drafts and the last sentence that had said what needed to be said. And about the morning, a supply wagon came down the road, and a woman in someone else's hat got off it and walked up to his gate with her shoulders set against a rejection that was never coming. She rode up to the gate and swung down and looked at him with the dirt on her face and the ledger under her arm and the particular expression that was entirely Annie, the one that was competent and present and occasionally amused at the world's refusal to be as organized as she would prefer. "The well allocation is fine," she said. "Someone left the cover off the secondary channel. I replaced it." "Thank you," he said. "Diego says supper is in 20 minutes, and if we are not at the table he will take it as a personal insult. I will be at the table." She started past him toward the house, then stopped and looked back at him in the evening light, and what she saw in his face made her pause with the particular attention she always paid to him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The gate," he said. She looked at the gate standing open behind her and then at him. "I was prepared," she said with the quiet certainty of someone who has known something for a long time, "for you to say no." "I know," he said, "and you opened it anyway." "Yes." She held his look for a moment, the way she had held it the very first time, across the arch of the gate in the Nevada July heat when she had been dusty and afraid and he had said her name like he had been waiting for it. "I am glad you did," she said. "So am I," he said. She went inside. He latched the gate for the evening and followed her home.